The Bible is filled with men and women who heard the voice of God and spoke on His behalf. But among all of them, 5 names stand above the rest. 5 prophets whose lives, words and calling shaped the entire biblical narrative in ways that still echo today. Their names are Moses, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel. In this video, we are going to walk through each one of them, who they were, what they faced, and why their stories still matter. There are stories that seem impossible from the very first line. Moses' story is one of them. It begins inside a basket of reeds drifting on the Nile, carrying a baby who had no business being alive. The Egyptian empire was at the height of its power, and the Hebrew people living within its borders had grown numerous enough to make the Pharaoh uneasy. His response was the kind of cruelty that power resorts to when it feels threatened. He ordered the death of every Hebrew boy born. It was not a military decree. It was an attempt to drown the future of an entire people in the very river they depended on to survive. But Jochebed, Moses' mother, refused to comply. She hid her son for 3 months. When hiding him became impossible, she did something that looks like surrender, but was actually an act of radical faith. Ushid. She placed him in a waterproofed basket and set it among the reeds at the edge of the Nile. His older sister Miriam watched from a distance to see what would happen. It did not take long. Pharaoh's own daughter came down to bathe and found the basket. Exodus 2:6 tells us that when she opened it and heard the child cry, she felt compassion for him. She recognized immediately that he was one of the Hebrew boys. And right there, in that moment of unexpected tenderness from the most dangerous household in Egypt, providence moved. Miriam stepped forward and offered to find a Hebrew woman to nurse the child. The woman brought to nurse Moses was his own mother, hired and paid by the royal family that had ordered his death. Moses grew up inside the palace. He was educated in all the knowledge of the Egyptians, which at that time meant the most advanced civilization on earth. Architecture, administration, law, military strategy. He had access to everything. But something in him never settled. He knew he was Hebrew, and that knowledge sat uneasily beneath the surface of his Egyptian life. The day the tension finally broke, Moses went out to witness the forced labor of his people. He saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew slave. He looked around, saw no one watching, killed the Egyptian, and buried him in the sand. The next day, he tried to intervene in a fight between 2 Hebrews, and one of them turned to him and said, "Do you mean to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" The secret was out. Pharaoh heard what had happened and wanted Moses dead. Moses fled to the land of Midian. He left behind everything Egypt had given him, his position, his education, his identity, and disappeared into the desert. He was 40 years old. He had no idea that the next chapter of his life would last another 40 years, and that none of it would look anything like what he had been trained for. Midian was not a dramatic location. There were no palaces there, no courts, no monuments. Moses arrived as a fugitive and ended up settling as a shepherd, working for Jethro, a priest of the region whose daughter Zipporah he married. The man who had been raised to rule spent the following 4 decades watching sheep in the desert. That detail is easy to pass over, but it deserves attention. 40 years is not a brief detour. It is a generation. It is long enough for the urgency of youth to quiet down, for the pride of education to soften, for a person to stop performing and simply exist. The desert has a way of stripping things down to what is essential, and what is essential is rarely what we think it is when we are young and full of ambition. During those years, Moses learned the geography of that wilderness in a way that would later prove indispensable every valley, every water source, every route across the rocky terrain. He learned patience in a way that managing enslaved laborers never could have taught him. He learned silence, and silence, as it turns out, is one of the primary conditions for hearing God. There is no dramatic account of what Moses thought during those 4 decades. The text does not give us his inner monologue, his doubts, his prayers. What we know is that when God finally appeared to him, Moses was not waiting with expectation. He was doing his job. He had driven his father-in-law's flock to the far side of the wilderness and come to Horeb, the mountain of God, without knowing that is what it was. The desert had not broken Moses, but it had made him available. Moses noticed the bush because it was burning without being consumed. That is the detail that stopped him. Not a voice, not a vision, not an angel appearing in glory. Just a small fire that was behaving incorrectly. He turned aside to look, and that is when God spoke. Exodus 3:4 records the moment simply. God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses!" And Moses answered, "Here I am." It is the same answer given by Abraham when God called, and by Samuel in the middle of the night. 3 words that contain everything: attention, presence, readiness. God told him to take off his sandals because the ground he was standing on was holy. Moses hid his face. He was afraid to look at God. Then the message came. God had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt. He had heard their cries. He knew their pain, and he was going down to deliver them. Then the harder part, "I am sending you to Pharaoh." Moses responded the way most honest people respond to an impossible assignment, with a question about his own adequacy. Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh? God did not answer by listing Moses' qualifications. He answered with something better. "I will be with you." When Moses asked for God's name, knowing that the Hebrews would want to know who had sent their deliverer, the answer he received was unlike any name in any religion of the ancient world. In Exodus 3:14, God said, "I am who I am. Tell them I am has sent you." The Hebrew behind that phrase, Ehyeh Asher Ehyeh, carries a weight that is almost impossible to translate. It speaks of pure, uncaused existence. Not a being who began at some point. Not a deity among other deities, but the ground of all being itself. The name Yahweh, which Israel would carry through all its generations, is rooted in the same verb. God is the one who simply and irreducibly is. Moses still hesitated. He said the people would not believe him. God gave him 3 signs: a staff that became a snake, a hand that turned leprous and was restored, water from the Nile that would turn to blood. Moses tried again. He was not eloquent. He was slow of speech. God reminded him that he was the one who made the human mouth. Finally, God assigned Aaron as Moses' spokesman, and the conversation was over. The mission had been given. The burning bush had done what no palace education ever could. It had sent a man not in the strength of his training, but in the strength of a promise he did not fully understand yet. When Moses and Aaron stood before Pharaoh and delivered the message, "Thus says the Lord, the God of Israel, let my people go," Pharaoh's response was the kind of answer that power always gives when it has not yet been humbled. "Who is the Lord that I should obey his voice? I do not know the Lord, and moreover, I will not let Israel go." Exodus 5:2. That declaration opened one of the most extraordinary sequences of events in ancient literature. What followed was not merely a series of natural catastrophes. Each of the 10 plagues was aimed at a specific dimension of Egyptian religious life. The Nile turning to blood was a direct challenge to Hapi, the god of the river. The darkness that covered Egypt for 3 days struck at Ra, the supreme sun god, the very deity the pharaoh himself was believed to embody. This was not simply a political confrontation. It was a theological demolition, carried out plague by plague, until every foundation of Egyptian religion had been tested and found incapable of response. The first 4 plagues, blood, frogs, lice, flies, escalated in severity. Pharaoh's own magicians managed to replicate the first 2, but by the 3rd, they admitted what the text records in Exodus 8:19 with quiet irony. This is the finger of God. Their ability to mimic the signs did not outlast the signs themselves. Plague after plague, the same pattern repeated. Pharaoh would soften, promise to let the people go, and then harden his heart once the immediate pressure was gone. Exodus 9:16 preserves one of the most theologically loaded statements in the entire narrative. God telling Pharaoh directly, "For this purpose I have raised you up, to show you my power, so that my name may be proclaimed in all the earth." The confrontation with Egypt was never only about freedom for Israel. It was about a declaration that would echo beyond Egypt, beyond that generation, to every corner of the known world. Before the 10th and final plague, God gave specific instructions to every Hebrew household. Exodus 12 describes them in careful detail. A lamb without blemish, slaughtered at twilight, its blood painted on the doorposts and the lintel of every home. When the angel passed through Egypt that night and saw the blood, he would pass over that house. The firstborn inside would be spared. The night the firstborn of Egypt died, including Pharaoh's own son, was the night Israel was finally released. They left carrying the wealth of Egypt on their shoulders, and they never looked back. The escape from Egypt did not end at the border. When Pharaoh reconsidered and sent his army in pursuit, Israel found itself with the sea ahead and 600 chariots behind. The people panicked. Moses told them in Exodus 14:13-14 to stand firm and watch. The Lord would fight for them, and they would need only to be still. That night, a strong east wind drove the water back, and the seabed dried. Israel crossed. The Egyptian army followed. When morning came, Moses stretched his hand over the sea, and the waters returned. Not one Egyptian soldier survived. On the far shore, Israel stood and watched the wreckage at their feet, and then they sang. A spontaneous explosion of praise, the first recorded hymn of a free people. The wilderness that followed tested them in different ways. Hunger came, and God sent manna. Thirst came, and God brought water from a rock. Enemies came, and as long as Moses held up his staff over the battle, Israel prevailed. 3 months after leaving Egypt, they reached the foot of Sinai. What happened on that mountain was the defining moment of Israel's identity as a nation. Deuteronomy 4:33 would later ask rhetorically whether any people had ever heard the voice of God speaking from the middle of fire and survived to tell about it. The answer, implied and real, was no. Only Israel. For 40 days and 40 nights, Moses was on the summit of the mountain. No food, no water, receiving the terms of the covenant that would govern every dimension of life for this people. Worship, justice, sexuality, work, speech, rest. The 10 Commandments were not arbitrary rules imposed by a distant deity. They were the moral architecture of a redeemed community. A people pulled out of slavery, now being shown what it meant to live as free human beings under a God who was unlike anything the surrounding nations had ever imagined. Moses came down from the mountain to find Israel worshipping a golden calf. In one of the most astonishing prayers in all of Scripture, he stood before God and interceded for a people who had just broken the covenant they had barely received. He asked God not to destroy them, and God relented. The relationship between Moses and God was unlike any other in the biblical record. Exodus 33:11 describes it with remarkable directness. The Lord spoke with Moses face to face, as a man speaks with his friend. When Moses asked to see God's glory, God hid him in the cleft of a rock and passed before him, declaring his name, merciful, gracious, slow to anger, abounding in steadfast love. When Moses came down from the mountain after those encounters, his face shone with a radiance the people could not look at directly. He had to wear a veil. At the end of his life, Deuteronomy 34 places Moses on the top of Mount Nebo, looking out over the land he would never enter. The consequence of one moment of disobedience at the waters of Meribah. He saw Gilead, Dan, Naphtali, the western sea, the valley of Jericho. He saw everything that had been promised. Then he died, alone with God on the mountain. No one ever found his grave. The same chapter closes with a statement that stands as one of the most honest summaries in the entire Old Testament. No prophet like Moses arose again in Israel. No one whom God knew face to face. No one who performed such signs and wonders before a whole nation. No one whose life stretched from a basket on a river to the edge of a promised land, holding together the history of a people who were nothing before him and who were never quite the same after him. The second prophet on this list is Elijah, and few figures in the entire Bible match the intensity with which he lived, the courage with which he spoke, and the drama with which he left. Most biblical figures are introduced gradually. There is a genealogy, a backstory, a slow build towards the moment they step onto the stage. Elijah gets none of that. He appears in 1 Kings 17:1 without warning, without ancestry, without explanation. A man from Tishbe in Gilead walking into the throne room of the most corrupt king Israel had ever seen, delivering a sentence and then disappearing. The sentence was this: there would be no rain in Israel, not a drop of dew, not a shower, nothing for years except by Elijah's word. To understand the weight of that declaration, it helps to know something about Ahab and the religious landscape he had built. He had married Jezebel, a Phoenician princess devoted to the worship of Baal. Under their rule, Israel had not merely tolerated foreign gods, it had institutionalized them. Baal was the Canaanite deity of storms, rain, and agricultural fertility. By announcing a drought in the name of Yahweh, Elijah was not just making a weather forecast. He was issuing a direct challenge to Baal on his own territory. The god who supposedly controlled the rain would be publicly exposed as powerless. The contest had been declared before anyone had agreed to play. After delivering his message, Elijah was told by God to leave. He went to the Cherith ravine east of the Jordan, where ravens brought him bread and meat twice a day, and he drank from the brook. It is an image that sits awkwardly beside the drama of his entrance. The most courageous prophet in Israel's history, hidden in a canyon being fed by birds. But God's provision does not always arrive in impressive packaging. When the brook dried up because there was no rain, God sent Elijah further, not back to Israel, but north to Zarephath, a town in Sidon, Jezebel's own territory. There he found a widow gathering sticks. She was down to her last handful of flour and a small amount of oil, preparing what she believed would be the last meal for herself and her son before they starved. Elijah asked her for water and bread. She explained her situation plainly, without self-pity, and he responded with a promise in 1 Kings 17:14 that asked everything of her before it gave anything back. The jar of flour will not be used up, and the jug of oil will not run dry until the day the Lord sends rain on the land. She believed him. She made the bread, and the flour and the oil held day after day, week after week, for as long as the drought lasted. When her son later became ill and stopped breathing, Elijah took the boy to his room, stretched himself over the child 3 times, and cried out to God. The boy's life returned to him. It was the first resurrection in the biblical record, and it happened quietly in a foreign widow's house, far from any audience. 3 years into the drought, God told Elijah to go back. Present yourself to Ahab, and I will send rain on the land. Kings 18:1. The 2 men met on the road, and Ahab's first words to Elijah were an accusation. Is that you, you troubler of Israel? Elijah turned it back without hesitation. The trouble in Israel had nothing to do with him. It came from Ahab and his father's house, from abandoning the commandments of God and following the Baals. Then came the challenge. Elijah told Ahab to summon all Israel to Mount Carmel, along with the 450 prophets of Baal and the 400 prophets of Asherah who ate at Jezebel's table. 850 religious professionals against 1 man. The terms were simple: 2 bulls, 2 altars, 2 prayers. Whichever God answered with fire would be recognized as the true God. The prophets of Baal went first. They prepared their bull, laid it on the wood, and began calling on their God from morning until noon. Nothing happened, no voice, no response, no fire. At midday, Elijah began to mock them, asking whether Baal might be deep in thought or away on a journey, or asleep and needing to be woken up. The Hebrew text carries genuine sarcasm, and the prophets responded by shouting louder, slashing themselves with swords and spears until blood flowed. They kept it up until the time of the evening sacrifice. Still nothing. Then Elijah stepped forward. He repaired the altar of the Lord that had been torn down. 12 stones, 1 for each tribe, dug a trench around it, arranged the wood and laid the bull on top. Then he did something that looked like self-sabotage. He had 4 large jars of water poured over the offering, 3 times, until the wood was soaked, the meat was soaked, and the trench was full of water. In the middle of a 3-year drought, that amount of water was itself an act of faith. The prayer he offered in 1 Kings 18:36-37 was brief and direct. Let it be known today that you are God in Israel, that I am your servant, and that I have done all this at your command. Answer me, Lord, so that these people will know that you are turning their hearts back again. Fire fell. It consumed the offering, the wood, the stones, the soil, and the water in the trench. The people fell face down and cried out, "The Lord, He is God! The Lord, He is God!" The 450 prophets of Baal were seized and killed at the Kishon River. Then Elijah climbed back to the top of Carmel, crouched down with his face between his knees, and sent his servant to look toward the sea 7 times. On the 7th trip, the servant came back with a report. A cloud the size of a man's hand was rising from the sea. By the time Ahab's chariot reached Jezreel, the sky was black and the rain was pouring down. What happened next is one of the most disorienting sequences in prophetic literature. The day after the greatest public victory of his ministry, Elijah ran for his life. Jezebel sent a messenger with a threat. By the next day, she would do to Elijah exactly what he had done to her prophets. And Elijah, the same man who had stood alone against hundreds, who had called fire from heaven, who had shut and opened the sky, broke. 1 Kings 19:3 says simply that he was afraid and ran for his life. He traveled south through Judah, left his servant behind in Beersheba, and went a full day's journey into the wilderness alone. Then he sat down under a broom tree and asked to die. "I have had enough, Lord. Take my life. I am no better than my ancestors." He lay down and fell asleep. What follows is one of the most quietly remarkable passages in the entire Old Testament. God did not rebuke him, did not send a vision, a sermon, or a theological correction. An angel touched him and said, "Get up and eat." There was bread baked over coals and a jar of water. Elijah ate and went back to sleep. The angel came a second time, touched him again and said in 1 Kings 19:7, "Get up and eat, for the journey is too much for you." The sequence matters. Before God spoke a single word of instruction or correction, he made sure the prophet had rested and eaten twice. The body has its own part to play in the life of faith, and ignoring it does not make someone more spiritual. It makes them more fragile. Elijah had poured everything out at Carmel and was running on empty. God's first response to that emptiness was not a demand. It was a meal. Strengthened by that food, Elijah walked 40 days and 40 nights to Horeb, the mountain of God, the same Sinai where Moses had received the law. The distance was enormous and the journey was deliberate. Elijah was not wandering. He was going back to the beginning, to the place where God had first spoken clearly to his people. At Horeb, God asked Elijah, "What are you doing here?" The question was not hostile. It was the kind of question that invites honesty, and Elijah answered honestly, pouring out everything he had been carrying. He had been zealous for God. The Israelites had rejected the covenant, torn down the altars and killed the prophets. He was the only one left, and now they were trying to kill him too. God told him to go out and stand on the mountain, for the Lord was about to pass by. Then came 3 things in sequence, each one enormous. First, a wind so powerful it tore the mountains apart and shattered rocks. Then, an earthquake. Then a fire. And in each case, 1 Kings 19:11-12 records the same phrase with quiet insistence. The Lord was not in it. After the fire there was a sound, translated variously as a still small voice, a gentle whisper, a low murmuring sound. The Hebrew is kol demama daka, which carries the sense of something barely audible, a voice made of near silence. And it was there, in that thread of sound, that God was present. The contrast with Carmel is pointed. That mountaintop had been fire and dramatic victory, and the roar of a crowd falling face down. But God was not housed in spectacle. The wind, the earthquake, and the fire may have preceded him, but none of them contained him. What contained him was the silence after all of it had passed. When Elijah heard it, he wrapped his face in his cloak and stood at the entrance of the cave. God asked the same question again. "What are you doing here, Elijah?" And Elijah gave the exact same answer as before, word for word. He had not changed his assessment of the situation, but God gave him 3 specific tasks, a new direction, and one piece of information that reframed everything. There were 7,000 in Israel who had not bowed to Baal. Not one. 7,000. Elijah was not alone. He never had been. The isolation he felt was real, but it was not the whole truth. God told Elijah to anoint Elisha, son of Shaphat, as his successor. He found him plowing a field with 12 pairs of oxen. Elijah walked past him and threw his cloak over Elisha's shoulders. No speech, no lengthy explanation. Just the weight of a mantle landing on a man's back. Elisha understood immediately what it meant. He ran after Elijah and asked only to say goodbye to his father and mother. Then he returned, slaughtered his oxen, burned his plowing equipment to cook the meat, gave it to the people around him, and left everything behind to follow Elijah. He burned the tools of his previous life so there would be no going back. For years, Elisha served beside him, not as a distant student, but in the way that genuine apprenticeship works, formed through shared roads and shared danger, and the kind of closeness that cannot be manufactured. The day of Elijah's departure was known in advance. As they walked together, Elijah asked what Elisha wanted before he was taken away. The answer in 2 Kings 2:9 was audacious. "Let me inherit a double portion of your spirit." Elijah said it was a hard thing to ask, but if Elisha saw him when he was taken, it would be granted. As they were walking and talking, 2 Kings 2:11 describes what happened. A chariot of fire and horses of fire appeared and separated the two men, and Elijah went up to heaven in a whirlwind. Elisha watched it happen. He cried out, "My father! My father! The chariots and horsemen of Israel!" and tore his own clothes in grief. The mantle of Elijah had fallen to the ground. Elisha picked it up, went back to the Jordan, struck the water with it and said, "Where now is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" The water divided. He crossed on dry ground. The prophets watching from Jericho saw it and acknowledged what had just happened. The spirit of Elijah rested on Elisha. Elijah never wrote a book. He left behind no collection of sermons, no extended prophecy, no document bearing his name. What he left was a mantle on the ground, a successor walking forward, and a legacy so enduring that centuries later, on a mountain in Galilee, he would appear alongside Moses, the two great pillars of the Old Testament, standing beside a man whose coming, both of them, in their own ways, had been pointing toward all along. The third prophet on this list stands apart from Moses and Elijah in one significant way. He left behind a book, not just any book. 66 chapters that range from scorching judgment to some of the most breathtaking promises ever written, covering a period of ministry that spanned the reigns of 4 different kings of Judah. His name was Isaiah, son of Amoz, and the opening line of his book places him immediately in history. He saw his visions during the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. But before any of the prophecies, before any of the confrontations with kings or nations, there was a single moment that defined everything Isaiah would ever say or do. It happened in the year King Uzziah died, a year of national uncertainty, a moment when the people of Judah were asking what would come next. Isaiah was in the temple, and what he saw there answered that question in a way that had nothing to do with politics. He saw the Lord seated on a throne, high and exalted, with the train of his robe filling the temple. Above him stood seraphim, beings of fire with 6 wings each, 2 covering their faces, 2 covering their feet, 2 used for flying. And they were calling to one another in Isaiah 6:3, "Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory." The doorposts and thresholds shook at the sound of their voices, and the temple filled with smoke. The threefold repetition of holy is not poetic decoration. In Hebrew literature, repeating a word 3 times is the strongest possible form of emphasis. It is the superlative of superlatives. There is no being, no force, no reality in existence that even approaches the holiness of God. And Isaiah, standing in the presence of that holiness, did not feel inspired. He felt destroyed. "Woe to me! I am ruined, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." Isaiah 6:5. The proximity of absolute purity did not make him feel elevated. It made him feel the full weight of what he was. His specific confession, unclean lips, is telling for a man whose entire ministry would be carried out through the words he spoke and wrote. Then one of the seraphim flew to him with a live coal taken from the altar using tongs, touched it to Isaiah's mouth and said, "Your guilt is taken away. Your sin is atoned for," the very instrument of his shame. His mouth became the place where grace was applied. And immediately after God spoke, "Whom shall I send? And who will go for us?" Isaiah's response in verse 8 was immediate and unconditional. "Here am I. Send me." It is worth noting the order. Isaiah did not volunteer first and get cleansed later. The commission came after the encounter with holiness, after the confession of inadequacy, after the act of divine cleansing. That sequence is not accidental. It is the pattern of genuine prophetic calling. And it would shape everything Isaiah said for the rest of his life. Isaiah did not operate from a distance. He was embedded in the political life of Jerusalem, speaking directly into the decisions of kings, at moments when those decisions carried the weight of national survival. Two of those moments stand out above the rest. The first involved King Ahaz, who faced a military alliance between Syria and the northern kingdom of Israel, threatening to invade Judah. The pressure on Ahaz to form his own counter-alliance with Assyria was enormous, and he was already moving in that direction when Isaiah intercepted him at the end of the aqueduct of the upper pool. The message God sent through Isaiah was direct. Do not be afraid. Do not lose heart. The two kingdoms threatening Judah were smoldering stumps, nearly burned out. They would not succeed. Then God told Ahaz, through Isaiah, to ask for a sign, any sign, from the depths of the earth to the heights of heaven. Ahaz refused, cloaking his unbelief in a veneer of piety. I will not put the Lord to the test. Isaiah 7:12. It was the answer of a man who had already made his decision and did not want a word from God complicating it. Isaiah's response cut through the pretense. It was not enough to try the patience of men. Ahaz was trying the patience of God himself. And then, to a king who refused to ask for a sign, God gave one anyway. Isaiah 7:14 contains one of the most discussed sentences in the entire Old Testament. Therefore the Lord himself will give you a sign. The virgin will conceive and give birth to a son, and will call him Emmanuel. The sign had an immediate dimension. Indeed, a child born in that generation whose growth would mark the timeline of the Assyrian threat. But the language reached further than any event in Ahaz's lifetime could satisfy. Emmanuel, God with us. The name pointed somewhere the prophet himself may not have fully understood. The second defining encounter was with King Hezekiah, one of the few kings in Judah's history described as genuinely faithful to God. When the Assyrian army under Sennacherib surrounded Jerusalem and its commander shouted psychological warfare at the population on the city walls, it was Ezekiel who went to the temple and spread out the threatening letter before God. Isaiah sent him a message recorded in 2 Kings 19:6-7. Do not be afraid. Sennacherib would hear a report that would make him return to his own country, and there he would fall by the sword. That night, 2 Kings 19:35 records that the angel of the Lord went through the Assyrian camp, and 185,000 soldiers were dead by morning. Sennacherib withdrew and was later killed by his own sons in his own temple. The word Isaiah had spoken held. There is a reason Isaiah has been called the fifth gospel. His book contains a density of messianic prophecy that has no parallel in the rest of the Old Testament. Specific enough to be recognizable in hindsight, yet written 7 centuries before the events it describes. Isaiah 9:2 opens a passage that begins in darkness and ends in a throne. The people walking in darkness have seen a great light. On those living in the land of deep darkness, a light has dawned. What follows is the announcement of a child, born, a son given, on whose shoulders government would rest. His name would be Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. The increase of his government and peace would have no end, established on David's throne forever. Every title in that list is worth sitting with separately. Mighty God, El Gibber in Hebrew, is not a title the Old Testament gives to a mere human, and yet it is applied here to a coming child. Isaiah 11 adds another layer to the portrait. A shoot from the stump of Jesse, David's father, would bear fruit. The Spirit of the Lord would rest on him, the Spirit of wisdom and understanding, of counsel and might, of knowledge and fear of the Lord. His reign would be characterized not by military superiority, but by justice for the poor and the needy. The wolf would lie down with the lamb. The earth would be full of the knowledge of the Lord as waters cover the sea. What makes these passages striking is not only their content, but their context. Isaiah was writing to a nation that was watching its political world fall apart. The northern kingdom would be destroyed by Assyria within decades, and Judah itself would eventually fall to Babylon. Into that deteriorating landscape, he kept pointing forward to something that no king of his time could produce or represent. He was describing a governance and a peace that history had not yet seen and could not generate on its own. The New Testament writers quoted Isaiah more than any other Old Testament prophet. Matthew, Luke, John, Paul, they all returned again and again to this book, recognizing in its language the shape of what had finally arrived. Isaiah himself did not live to see it, but he wrote as though he could. No passage in Isaiah has generated more reflection, more debate, and more reverence than chapter 53. It sits at the center of what scholars call the servant songs. 4 poems in the second half of the book that describe a figure who will accomplish God's purposes not through power, but through suffering. The chapter opens in Isaiah 52:13 with a paradox. The servant will be exalted and lifted up, yet his appearance was so disfigured that many were appalled at him. He had nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows, familiar with suffering. People hid their faces from him. Then the text makes the theological pivot that has echoed through centuries of reflection. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering, yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. Isaiah 53:4-5. The mechanism described here is substitution. 1. Bearing the weight of what belongs to others, not as a victim of random suffering, but as a willing participant in a redemptive exchange. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, he did not open his mouth. He was assigned a grave with the wicked, yet after his death he would see light and be satisfied. The Lord's will would prosper in his hand. When the Ethiopian official in Acts 8 was reading this passage and Philip asked if he understood it, the man's question was honest. Tell me, please, who is the prophet talking about? Himself or someone else? It is the right question. The chapter is so specific. The silence before accusers, the grave with the wicked, the life after death, the healing purchased through wounds, that it demands an answer. The early church gave it one without hesitation. The second half of Isaiah shifts in tone. The judgment is not gone, but something else moves to the front. Comfort. Isaiah 40 opens with 2 words that function like a door swinging open after a long night. Comfort. Comfort my people, says your God. Speak tenderly to Jerusalem and proclaim to her that her hard service has been completed, that her sin has been paid for. Isaiah 40:1-2. What follows is among the most sustained and beautiful prose in the entire biblical canon. A voice is crying out in the wilderness to prepare the way of the Lord, to make straight a highway for God across the desert. Every valley will be raised up, every mountain brought low, the rough ground made level. And then this, in verse 5, the glory of the Lord will be revealed, and all people will see it together. The Gospel of Mark opens its account of John the Baptist by quoting this exact passage: the voice crying in the wilderness, the preparation of the way. Isaiah had described it 7 centuries earlier. Matthew, Luke, and John all do the same. The consensus of the New Testament writers was that John's ministry in the Judean desert was the fulfillment of what Isaiah had announced. But Isaiah did not stop there. The same chapter that announces the forerunner also contains one of the most famous meditations on the nature of God in all of Scripture. Who has measured the waters in the hollow of his hand? Who has held the dust of the earth in a basket? The nations are like a drop in a bucket, like fine dust on a set of scales. The inhabitants of the earth are like grasshoppers. He sits enthroned above the circle of the earth. He brings princes to nothing and reduces the rulers of the world to emptiness. And then, addressed to a people worn out by exile and waiting and unanswered prayer, Isaiah 40:28-31 asks, "Do you not know? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom. He gives strength to the weary and increases the power of the weak. Even youths grow tired and weary, and young men stumble and fall. But those who hope in the Lord will renew their strength. They will soar on wings like eagles. They will run and not grow weary. They will walk and not be faint." Isaiah died, according to Jewish tradition, by being sawn in two during the reign of the wicked King Manasseh. The verse in Hebrews 11:37 that mentions those who were sawn in two is widely understood as a reference to him. He left behind a book that the Dead Sea Scrolls preserved intact, nearly word for word, in a manuscript 1,000 years older than any previously known copy. Every chapter, every prophecy, every word about the servant who would be pierced for our transgressions, the voice that would cry in the wilderness, the child who would be called Emmanuel. A man who walked into the temple one ordinary day saw something that undid him completely and spent the rest of his life trying to describe what lay on the other side of it. Moses had hesitated. Isaiah had confessed his unworthiness and then immediately said, "Send me." The fourth prophet on this list did something closer to neither. He pushed back, argued, and spent the better part of his ministry wishing he had never been called at all. His name was Jeremiah, son of Hilkiah, a priest from the small town of Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. And from the opening chapter of his book, it is clear that what God was asking of him was not something he wanted. The word of the Lord came to him with a statement that reached behind his own birth. "Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations." Jeremiah 1:5. It was a declaration of purpose that predated every choice Jeremiah had ever made, every experience that had shaped him, every fear he carried. God had known him before he existed in any form a human being could recognize, and he had been set apart before he drew his first breath. Jeremiah's response was not worship, it was protest. "Alas, sovereign Lord, I do not know how to speak. I am too young." Jeremiah 1:6. The word translated young, na in Hebrew, could refer to anyone from an infant to a young man. Jeremiah was almost certainly in his late teens or early 20s, old enough to understand the weight of what was being asked, young enough to feel completely inadequate for it, speaking publicly, speaking against kings and priests and an entire religious establishment. That was not the life of a priest's son from a small town outside Jerusalem. God did not negotiate with the objection. He simply set it aside. Do not say, "I am too young." You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. Then he reached out, touched Jeremiah's mouth and said, "I have put my words in your mouth." The same gesture, essentially, as the coal on Isaiah's lips, the inadequate mouth becoming the instrument of divine speech. Two visions followed to anchor Jeremiah's calling. The first was an almond branch. In Hebrew, shaked, whose root is related to the word for watching or staying awake. God told him he was watching, shocked, to see that his word was fulfilled. The second vision was a boiling pot tilted away from the north, about to spill its contents southward. Disaster was coming from the north. Kingdoms would be summoned. They would set their thrones at the entrance of Jerusalem's gates, and judgment would come upon Judah for abandoning God and burning incense to other gods. Jeremiah was 20 years old, more or less, when he received that calling. He would carry it for over 40 years, through the reigns of 5 kings, through the siege and destruction of Jerusalem, through exile and personal suffering that wore him down, in ways no other prophet describes with such raw honesty. He did not want the job. He never stopped doing it. Jeremiah began his ministry during the reign of King Josiah, or one of the few genuinely faithful kings in Judah's history, the man who found the book of the law in the temple during renovations and wept when it was read to him. Those early years were not easy for Jeremiah, but they were not the worst. The worst came later, when Josiah died in battle at Megiddo, and the kings who followed undid everything he had, built one after another. From that point forward, Jeremiah was preaching into a current running hard against him. He called the people to repentance in the temple courts, and was told never to preach there again. He dictated his prophecies to his scribe Baruch, who read them aloud in the temple. And when King Jehoiakim heard the scroll, he cut it apart with a knife column by column and threw it into the fire as it was read to him. Jeremiah 36:24 notes with devastating plainness that neither the king nor any of his attendants showed the slightest alarm or tore their clothes in mourning. The physical suffering came in concentrated waves. A priest named Pashhur, the chief officer of the temple, had Jeremiah beaten and put in stocks overnight at the upper gate of Benjamin. Jeremiah was thrown into a cistern by a group of officials who argued that his preaching about the fall of Jerusalem was weakening the morale of the soldiers and the population. The cistern had no water in it, only mud, and Jeremiah sank into the mud. He remained there until an Ethiopian official named Ebed-Melech persuaded the king to have him pulled out with ropes padded with old rags so the cords would not cut into his skin under his arms. He was forbidden to marry and have children, not as personal punishment, but as a living sign to the people. God told him in Jeremiah 16:2-4 that in the place where he was, there would be no marriage celebrations, no funeral mourning, because what was coming would be so total that ordinary human rituals would be stripped away. Jeremiah carried that isolation his entire life. No wife, no children, rejected by his own townspeople in Anathoth who plotted against him, misunderstood by the very people he was trying to save. Through all of it, he kept preaching, not because it was working, it was not, but because, as he would later confess in one of his most raw statements, he could not stop. The word of God in his bones was like a fire he could not contain, no matter how hard he tried. What makes Jeremiah unlike any other prophet in the Old Testament is the window his book opens into his interior life. Most prophets deliver their messages and the narrative moves on. Jeremiah argues, laments, accuses, and despairs in passages so personal that they have been called his confessions, a series of prayers scattered through the book that read less like formal petitions and more like a man at the edge of his endurance saying out loud what most people would be afraid to think. In Jeremiah 12:1, he opens with a question that has troubled honest readers of Scripture in every generation. You are always righteous, Lord, when I bring a case before you, yet I would speak with you about your justice. Why does the way of the wicked prosper? Why do all the faithless live at ease? It is not a theoretical question. He had watched the people who rejected his message live comfortably while he suffered for delivering it. He wanted an explanation. God's answer in chapter 12 is not a reassurance, it is a challenge. If running with foot soldiers has worn you out, how will you keep up with horses? If you stumble in safe country, how will you manage in the thickets by the Jordan? It is the answer of someone who is telling Jeremiah that harder things are still ahead, and that endurance, not comfort, is what the moment requires. In Jeremiah 15:18, the prophet pushes further. Why is my pain unending and my wound grievous and incurable? You are to me like a deceptive brook, like a spring that fails. He was accusing God of being unreliable. It is one of the most startling sentences a human being has ever addressed to the divine. God's response, "If you repent, I will restore you," is firm but not dismissive. The conversation is taken seriously. The complaint is heard. The darkest passage comes in Jeremiah 20:14-18, after his night in the stocks. He cursed the day of his birth. He wished the man who brought his father the news of his birth had never come. He asked why he had come out of the womb, to see only toil and sorrow, to end his days in shame. It is anguish stripped of any theological polish. A man who felt that the weight of his calling had cost him everything a human life is supposed to hold, and yet he did not quit. Between the laments there are declarations of trust, moments where Jeremiah remembers what he knows to be true even when he cannot feel it. In Jeremiah 20:11, just a few verses before his darkest curse, he says, "But the Lord is with me like a mighty warrior, so my persecutors will stumble and not prevail." The faith and the despair do not cancel each other out. They coexist, sometimes in the same breath. That tension is what makes Jeremiah's voice so recognizable to anyone who has ever tried to hold on to God in circumstances that made holding on seem unreasonable. Jeremiah had spent decades warning that Jerusalem would fall. He had said it in the temple courts, in the palace, in written scrolls, in dramatized signs that included walking through the city, wearing a wooden yoke around his neck to symbolize the bondage that was coming. The religious establishment called him a traitor. The people called him a liar and a coward. The false prophets said peace, peace, when there was no peace. And the crowds preferred their message. In 586 BC, Babylon arrived in force. Nebuchadnezzar's army surrounded Jerusalem, and the siege lasted a year and a half. When the city walls finally broke, the Babylonian officials entered and sat down at the middle gate. King Zedekiah fled at night with his soldiers through the king's garden, heading for the Jordan Valley. He was overtaken near Jericho. His sons were killed in front of him. Then his eyes were put out. The last thing he ever saw was the death of his children, and he was taken to Babylon in bronze shackles. The temple was burned. The palace was burned. Every significant building in Jerusalem was set on fire by the commander of the imperial guard. The walls of the city were broken down. The people who remained were taken into exile in Babylon, leaving behind only the poorest of the land to tend the vineyards and work the fields. Jeremiah had been put under guard in the courtyard of the palace during the siege, and when the Babylonians found him, Nebuchadnezzar gave specific orders that he was to be treated well and given whatever he wanted. Jeremiah was released and given the choice to come to Babylon or to stay. He chose to stay with the remnant of the people in the land under the governorship of Gedaliah. What he wrote in the ruins of that city became the Book of Lamentations, 5 poems of grief over what Jerusalem had become. The first 3 words of the book in Hebrew are echa, which means how or alas, the traditional word of mourning. How deserted lies the city once so full of people. How like a widow is she who once was great among the nations. Lamentations Q-O. Norsishu Huanba. Mwadish Ithu. And Shiuayets. He described the streets empty, the gates desolate, the priests groaning, the young women grieving. He did not soften it. He did not rush to the comfort. He sat in the wreckage and described it exactly as it was. Chapter 3 of Lamentations contains the passage that has kept the book from being merely a document of despair. In the middle of his most personal account of suffering, Jeremiah wrote in verses 22 to 23, "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed, for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning, great is your faithfulness." It is not triumphalism. It is a small light held up in a very dark room. The statement of a man who had lost almost everything, choosing to anchor himself to what could not be taken. In the middle of Jeremiah's book, surrounded by accounts of siege and suffering and national collapse, there is a section that scholars sometimes call the Book of Consolation. Chapters 30 through 33, a cluster of promises so expansive and forward-looking that they seem almost out of place in such a dark context, which is, of course, exactly the point. The most important of those promises comes in Jeremiah 31 through 134, and it is no exaggeration to say it is one of the most theologically significant passages in the entire Old Testament. God was announcing something that had never existed before. "The days are coming," declares the Lord, "when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt." The old covenant, given at Sinai through Moses, had been written on stone tablets. It was external, a law outside the person, demanding compliance from the outside in. The new covenant God was announcing through Jeremiah would operate differently. "I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." The law would move from stone to flesh, from the outside to the inside, from obligation to inclination, and then the line that reaches even further. "For I will forgive their wickedness, and will remember their sins no more." Jeremiah 31:34. Not manage their sins, not cover them temporarily through repeated sacrifice, forget them. The verb used is one of complete and final removal. God choosing not to hold what could be held against them. The writer of Hebrews quotes this passage in full. The longest Old Testament quotation in the entire New Testament, and builds his argument around it in chapters 8 and 9. He points out that the very word "new" in Jeremiah's prophecy made the first covenant old, and what is aging and obsolete is ready to disappear. The new covenant Jeremiah announced found its moment at a table in Jerusalem, the night before the crucifixion, when Jesus took a cup of wine and said in Luke 22:20, "This cup is the new covenant in my blood, which is poured out for you. Jeremiah never saw it. He lived out the rest of his life in Egypt, taken there against his will by a group of frightened survivors who ignored his counsel not to go, and who likely died there. The tradition of his death offers nothing encouraging. There was no chariot of fire, no peaceful mountaintop, no quiet end. Just a man who had carried a word he did not want, in a direction he did not choose, for longer than most people could have endured. But the word he carried outlasted everything that tried to silence it. The covenant he announced is still the covenant that millions of people around the world enter every time they take bread and wine and remember what was done for them. Jeremiah wrote it down in the ruins of a city, addressed to a people in exile, at a moment when everything suggested that God had gone silent. He had not gone silent. He was writing on hearts. The fifth and final prophet on this list is Ezekiel, and in many ways he is the most difficult to approach. Moses led a nation. Elijah confronted kings. Isaiah wrote poetry that reads like prophecy, and prophecy that reads like poetry. Jeremiah wept over a city. Ezekiel did something different from all of them. He saw things that the human mind struggles to hold, described them with the precision of an engineer and the imagination of a visionary, and delivered his messages through dramatic signs that made the people around him question his sanity. He was, by any measure, the most unusual of the major prophets. His ministry began in 593 BC, 5 years after the first wave of Judean exiles had been taken to Babylon. Ezekiel was among them, a priest, the son of Buzi, living beside the Chebar Canal in the land of the Chaldeans. He was 30 years old, the age at which a priest would normally have begun his full temple service in Jerusalem. Instead, he was in exile, far from the temple, surrounded by a community of displaced people, trying to make sense of what had happened to them. It was there, beside that canal, that the heavens opened. What Ezekiel saw is described in the first chapter of his book with a level of detail that has fascinated and puzzled readers for 26 centuries. A great cloud was coming from the north, with flashing lightning and surrounded by brilliant light. Inside the cloud were 4 living creatures, each with 4 faces: the face of a man, the face of a lion, the face of an ox, and the face of an eagle. Each had 4 wings, straight legs with feet like polished bronze, and human hands under their wings. They moved in every direction without turning, driven by the Spirit. Beside each creature was a wheel on the ground, wheels that intersected each other at right angles, so that the structure could move in any direction without rotating. The rims of the wheels were covered with eyes. When the living creatures moved, the wheels moved with them. When they rose from the ground, the wheels rose too. Above the heads of the creatures was an expanse like a crystal vault. Above the expanse was something like a throne of sapphire, and seated on it was a figure with the appearance of a man, surrounded by brilliant light and fire, like a rainbow on a rainy day. Ezekiel 1:28 records his response. "When I saw it, I fell face down, and I heard the voice of one speaking." He did not attempt to explain what he had seen. He fell. The appropriate response to the presence of God is not analysis and prostration. And Ezekiel understood that instinctively. What the vision communicated to a community of exiles who feared that God had abandoned them was this: the glory of God was not confined to the temple in Jerusalem. It was mobile, present, active, here beside a canal in Babylon, as fully as it had ever been anywhere. The wheels within wheels, the movement in every direction, the eyes covering the rims. Nothing could happen outside God's awareness, and no geography could place a people beyond his reach. That was the message before a single word of prophecy was spoken. Where Isaiah wrote and Jeremiah wept, Ezekiel acted. His method of prophetic communication was unlike anything in the biblical record. A series of physical dramatizations so extreme, so prolonged, and so deliberately strange that they would be impossible to ignore. God did not merely give Ezekiel words to speak. He gave him a body to use as a message. The first dramatic sign came immediately after his calling. God told him to lie on his left side for 390 days, 1 day for each year of Israel's sin, bearing the punishment of the house of Israel. Then he was to turn over and lie on his right side for 40 days, bearing the punishment of Judah. During this entire period, he was to eat bread baked over cow dung, rationed by weight, and drink water measured by volume. The quantities were deliberately insufficient. A dramatization of the siege conditions that Jerusalem would experience. Ezekiel 4:9-10 specifies the daily ration, 20 shekels of food and 1/6 of a hin of water. The same chapter describes another sign. Ezekiel was to take a clay tablet and draw the city of Jerusalem on it, then build siege works against it, ramps, camps, battering rams, and set an iron pan between himself and the city as a wall. He was to stare at it, the city under siege and the prophet watching it, separated by iron, a dramatization of God's face turned against his own city. In Ezekiel 5, God told him to shave his head and beard with a sharp sword. An act of extreme humiliation in ancient culture, particularly for a priest. He was to divide the hair into 3 parts, burn 1/3 in the middle of the city model when the siege days were complete, strike another 1/3 with the sword around the city, and scatter the last 1/3 to the wind. A small number of hairs were to be tucked into the folds of his robe, a remnant preserved from the destruction. When Ezekiel's wife died, God told him in Ezekiel 24:16-17 not to mourn her, not to weep, not to perform the traditional mourning rituals, not to accept food from those who came to comfort him. She was the delight of his eyes, and she died in the evening. The next morning he spoke to the people as usual. When they asked why he was not mourning, he told them that what had just happened to him was a sign of what was about to happen to them. Be the delight of their eyes, the temple would be taken, and they would be too stunned and ashamed to mourn in the usual way. Each of these signs operated on the same principle. The prophet's body and life became the medium of the message. The people could look away from words. They could dismiss a scroll, but a man lying on his side for over a year, eating rationed food cooked over dung, shaving his head with a sword, refusing to weep for his own wife, that was harder to ignore and harder still to forget. Among all the visions in Ezekiel's book, the most theologically devastating is not one of the elaborate ones. It is a departure, slow, reluctant, step by step. The glory of God leaving the temple. The sequence begins in Ezekiel 8, when God transported the prophet in a vision to Jerusalem. What he showed him there was a catalogue of the abominations that had turned the temple, the house that bore God's name, into a place of idol worship. In the inner court, an idol had been set up at the very entrance. In a side room, 70 elders of Israel were burning incense to images carved on the walls. Every kind of creeping thing, detestable animal and idol. Women were weeping for the god Tammuz at the north gate. 25 men stood at the entrance to the temple with their backs turned to it, bowing east toward the sun. The vision that followed in chapters 9 and 10 was God's response to what Ezekiel had been shown. Men with weapons moved through the city. A man clothed in linen moved among them, marking the foreheads of those who grieved over the detestable things being done, a remnant within the corruption. The others received no mark. Then, in Ezekiel 10, the glory of the Lord, the same kabod that had filled the tabernacle in Moses' day and the temple in Solomon's day began to move. It rose from above the cherubim and moved to the threshold of the temple. Then it moved to the east gate. Then, in Ezekiel 11:23, it went up from the middle of the city and stopped above the mountain east of it. The Mount of Olives. It did not leave in one dramatic moment. It paused. It lingered at each threshold as if reluctant to go, as if giving the city every possible opportunity to call it back. But no one called it back. The glory departed from a house that had been filled with everything, except the one who was supposed to fill it. The tragedy of that departure is the emotional center of Ezekiel's entire ministry. Everything else he said, every judgment, every lament, every promise, makes the most sense when read against the backdrop of that slow withdrawal. But the same God who departed also promised in Ezekiel 43:4-5 to return, and the conditions under which he would return would be different from anything that had existed before. Ezekiel 37 is the chapter that most people know, and it deserves the attention it has received. It is one of the most arresting visions in prophetic literature, not because of its complexity, like the chariot vision, but because of its simplicity and its emotional weight. The hand of the Lord came on Ezekiel and brought him out by the Spirit into a valley. The valley was full of bones. Ezekiel was led back and forth among them, and the text pauses to make sure the reader understands the condition of what he was looking at. The bones were very dry, not recently dead, not still bearing any trace of life. These were bones that had been in the open air long enough for every trace of moisture to leave them. Whatever these represented, it had been dead for a very long time. God asked him, "Son of man, can these bones live?" Ezekiel 37:3. It is one of the most carefully constructed questions in Scripture. There are only two honest answers. One is yes, which requires a faith that the evidence makes look absurd. The other is no, which is what the evidence actually suggests. Ezekiel chose neither. He said, "Sovereign Lord, you alone know." It was not evasion. It was the most accurate thing a human being could say, standing in a valley of dry bones. An acknowledgement that the answer to that question lay entirely outside his own competence. God told him to prophesy to the bones. Ezekiel spoke, and the sound that followed was a rattling. Bones coming together, bone to bone, the skeleton of an army assembling itself in the valley. Then tendons appeared, then flesh, then skin, but there was no breath in them. God told Ezekiel to prophesy to the breath. In Hebrew, ruach, which means breath, wind and spirit simultaneously. Come, breath, from the four winds, and breathe into these slain, that they may live. Ezekiel 37:9. He prophesied as he was commanded, and breath entered the bodies. They stood on their feet, a vast army. The interpretation God gave was specific. These bones are the people of Israel. They were saying their bones were dried up. Their hope was gone. They were cut off. But God would open their graves, bring them up from those graves, and bring them back to the land of Israel. He would put his spirit in them, and they would live. The vision addressed the immediate crisis of the exile. A people who felt dead as a nation, whose national identity and covenant relationship with God seemed to have been extinguished along with the temple. But the language of breath and spirit and resurrection reached further than one historical moment. The New Testament writers read it alongside other prophetic texts about the spirit and life, and saw in it a pattern that would be fulfilled not just in the return from exile, but in the resurrection of the dead at the end of the age. the Valley of Dry Bones became one of the foundational images of Christian hope. The confidence that what looks irreversibly finished is not the last word, because the last word belongs to the one who makes dry bones stand up and breathe. The book of Ezekiel ends with 9 chapters, 40 through 48, that describe a temple in extraordinary architectural detail. Every measurement is given: the thickness of walls, the dimensions of gates, the depth of vestibules, the placement of chambers. Ezekiel is guided through it by a man whose appearance was like bronze, holding a linen cord and a measuring rod. Room by room, court by court, the vision unfolds with the precision of a building specification. The temple Ezekiel saw was never built. No structure matching its dimensions has ever stood on the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. What it represented, whether a literal future building, a symbolic picture of the restored community, or an image that finds its fulfillment in something beyond any physical structure, has been debated for centuries. What is clear is that the vision was given to a man in exile, surrounded by the architecture of Babylon, as a declaration that God's dwelling place was not permanently gone. It would return, and it would be greater than what had been destroyed. In the middle of the temple vision, Ezekiel 47 describes something that starts small and grows beyond measuring. Water was trickling from below the threshold of the temple, flowing east from the south side of the altar. The man with the measuring rod led Ezekiel into it, first ankle deep. Then he measured another 1,000 cubits, and it was knee deep. Another 1,000, and it was waist deep. Another 1,000, and it had become a river that could not be crossed, deep enough to swim in, wide enough to be beyond measure. Wherever the river flowed, life followed. Trees grew on both banks. The water entered the sea, understood as the Dead Sea, the most saline and lifeless body of water in the region. And the salt water was made fresh. Swarms of living creatures appeared wherever the river went. Fishermen stood along its banks. Every kind of fruit tree grew on both sides, bearing fruit every month, their leaves providing healing. The image carries a theological density that goes well beyond geography. In the ancient world, the temple was understood as the place where heaven touched earth, where the life of God flowed into the human world. The river flowing from beneath the altar was a picture of what happens when the presence of God is genuinely at the center of a community. Life moves outward from that center in increasing measure, reaching into places that were previously dead, healing what was previously beyond healing. The Gospel of John reaches back to this image when it records Jesus standing in the temple courts during the Feast of Tabernacles and crying out in John 7:38, "Whoever believes in me, as Scripture has said, rivers of living water will flow from within them." He was speaking of the Spirit. The river from Ezekiel's temple had found its source. The book of Revelation reaches back to it again in its final chapters. A river of the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God and of the Lamb, down the middle of the great street of the city, with the tree of life on each side bearing fruit every month, and leaves for the healing of the nations. Revelation 22:1-2. The river that began as a trickle beneath a threshold in a vision given to a displaced priest beside a canal, in Babylon had become the defining image of the world as it was always meant to be. The last line of Ezekiel's book, in 48:35, is the name given to the city at the center of the vision. It is not a political name, not a dynastic name, not the name of any king or conqueror. It is simply this: the Lord is there. Of all the ways a prophet could end a book written in exile, at a moment when God's presence seemed to have withdrawn from the world entirely, that name is the one Ezekiel chose. not the Lord was there. Past tense, a memory. Not the Lord will be there. Future tense, a hope held at arm's length. Present tense, active, permanent. The Lord is there. That is where the 5 greatest prophets of the Bible ultimately point. Not to their own visions or miracles or writings, but to a presence that no exile could remove, no siege could destroy, and no silence could extinguish. Moses saw it in a burning bush. Elijah heard it in a whisper. Isaiah caught a glimpse of it filling a temple with smoke. Jeremiah felt it being written on a broken people's hearts. And Ezekiel watched it depart, then spent the rest of his life describing what it would look like when it returned. It returned. And according to the writers of the New Testament, it came not as fire descending on a building, but as a person walking into history, and the name they gave him was the same name Isaiah had announced 7 centuries before. Emmanuel, God with us. These 5 men, Moses, Elijah, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and Ezekiel, lived in different centuries, faced different kings, and carried their calling in different ways. One led a nation through a desert. Another called fire from the sky. One wrote prophecies so precise that entire books of the New Testament were built on them. One wept in the ruins of everything he had warned would fall. And one saw visions beside a canal in exile. That the last pages of the Bible are still echoing. They were not perfect men. Moses doubted his own voice. Elijah ran from a threat after calling down fire from heaven. Jeremiah spent decades wishing he had never been born into his calling. But what made them prophets was not their strength. It was their willingness to carry a word that was bigger than they were, in circumstances that gave them every reason to stop. And the word they carried, from the burning bush to the river flowing from the temple, pointed in a single direction, toward a presence that could not be contained in any building, silenced by any empire, or extinguished by any exile. A presence that Ezekiel's last line named in 2 words. In the present tense, without qualification. The Lord is there. If this video moved something in you, if these stories opened a door into the biblical world that you had not walked through before, consider sharing it with someone who would benefit from hearing them. There are people in your life who have never sat with Moses at the foot of Sinai, or stood beside Elijah on Mount Carmel, or heard Isaiah describe a servant crushed for the sins of others. You can be the one who puts this in front of them. And if you want to keep going deeper into the stories the Bible carries, the prophecies, the lives, the moments that changed the course of history, subscribe to this channel. There is far more to explore, and we are just getting started.